Konnichiwa. I'm Abby Martin, and this is Breaking the Set. Well, the Tokyo Electric Power Company is officially one of the worst companies in the world. See, there's been another leak discovered at the Fukushima nuclear plant, and this time, it's from one of the 1,000 tanks housing radioactive water. You know, this is really starting to get old. TEPCO is responsible for what seems like one catastrophe after another since the 2011 earthquake. First, they lied about the scope of the damage. Then they hid the fact that 300 tons of radioactive water has been leaking into the Pacific every day for the last 2 years. And now, another leak in TEPCO's poorly built storage tanks is responsible for spilling another 300 tons of radioactive water into the ocean. And if that isn't ridiculous enough, just check out today's headline. Fukushima worker accidentally switches off cooling pumps. Seriously? Wow, I'm glad there's so much room for human error with such a deadly technology. You know, I'm almost to the point in thinking that TEPCO's deliberately trying to destroy the planet. And if you're an American seafood eater at all concerned with radioactive fish ending up on your plate, you should be. Because 91% of imported seafood is not being inspected during the government shutdown. So while Congress continues to act like petulant children, I guess we'll hope for the best. In a post-9/11 world, the word terrorism is one of the most meaningless yet frequently used terms today. It's become a blanket label for everything from political violence to social unrest if the person or group committing said act is at odds with U.S. government policy. However, despite the fact that foreign and domestic policy is driven by fighting this tactic, there's no official government guideline on what defines terrorism. Seems a bit disconcerting when you realize that a word with no precise definition is one that's come to define our country. It's repeated ad nauseum throughout political speeches. It's used as the reasoning behind the classification of government files, and it's the final layer of judgment for the indefinite imprisonment of a potentially violent individual. So I set out to find out what the word really stands for and why it's so broadly applied today. Earlier, I spoke to Lisa Stampnitsky, author of the book Disciplining Terror, and I first asked her why the so-called terror experts have it all wrong.
Part of the problem is that the concept of terrorism itself is a really problematic concept. It's undefinable in that terrorism experts themselves are working with many different definitions and unable to agree on what the definition should be. And it's got a number of suppositions built into it that make it really difficult for people to create rational or scientific knowledge about it.
And in your book, you describe how political violence came to be labeled terrorism. Why did this evolution occur?
So my argument is that political violence came to be labeled terrorism in the 1970s, and that before that, political violence, including things that we would now say are obviously terrorism, like hijackings and hostage takings, weren't really understood through this terrorism framework. I argue that it's both because there were a number of new kinds of incidents in the early 1970s, hijackings and so forth, which targeted Americans and Westerners, violence, especially post-colonial violence that went out of place. And this attracted the attention of the American government. But then the second part is that over the course of the 1970s, the way that experts and people in the government were talking about this political violence, this problem that they started to call terrorism, changed significantly.
And you talk about also how the RAND Corporation was the first entity to turn the concept of terrorism into an object of knowledge and quantify the trends of terror. What is problematic about this approach?
You know, I mean, there are some things that are problematic about it, and there are some things that are not inherently problematic, but are just made difficult by the way we understand terrorism. So in order to quantify anything, you need to, meaning quantification, meaning make it subject to counting. You have to be able to agree on what it is and what it isn't. So in order to construct these databases, people have to decide what counts as terrorism, does an incident count as terrorism, and does it not? And because terrorism is such a conflicted and contested concept, it's inherently political anytime you do that. So, that's why creating these processes of quantification has been so problematic. It's not anything necessarily about the process itself.
Sure. And you talk about, obviously, experts invented terrorism as we know today, and terrorism is inventing the experts. Is the war on terror essentially a giant feedback loop at this point?
I mean, you could see it that way, although I would say that, sort of there are many other actors in there besides terrorists and terrorism experts. But, there is a sense in which, sort of we have this war on terror, which is a thing that, sort of we don't really even know what it is, and that in order to continue the war on terror, we need to decide what is terror and what is terrorism.
Well, let's talk about the roots of radicalization, because we're constantly being bombarded from the media and political establishment about what the threat is without having that greater discussion about the motivation for violence, the roots of radicalization. How does this affect the way the average person understands the concept?
It's funny because one of the things that I argue in the book is that while there is, commonly a question about what are the roots of violence, or, sort of these questions about what radicalizes people, at the same time, one of my arguments is that the way that we came to understand terrorism from the 1970s up until the current period actually precludes us understanding the roots of violence in certain ways, because the concept of terrorism has built into it this idea that terrorists are these immoral, irrational actors. And so even in so much as we want to understand why do people commit these acts, there's, in the back of our heads and sort of always echoing in public discourse, these ideas that, well, terrorists are just irrational and they do these things just because they're evil, right? This idea of evil recurred continually throughout the Bush administration particularly. And if something is evil, you don't need to have an explanation. You don't need to understand why this political violence is occurring. You just say, well, it's evil, and that's it.
Well, it's undeniable that that is still perpetuated throughout the establishment, the fact that this kind of evil mythic, this grand myth about the evildoers, I guess you could say it's in a little bit more intelligent way now, but it's still there. Who's
absolutely.
really benefiting from keeping the public misinformed about the greater picture, I guess?
You can say that, in a sense, states benefit from it, because states can manipulate the concept of terrorism in order to try and point it at, these are the groups that, what we don't like, so they're terrorists. And, you see this continually. You can look at any region of the world and see states, fighting against insurgents within their state or outside their state, and they'll use this label of terrorist in order to try to de-legitimate these groups.
Absolutely, yeah. It's so subjective at this point. One man's terrorist is another man's freedom fighter. How powerful of a role do you think semantics plays into the influence that people's perception is of what a terrorist is?
I think it's extremely important. I mean, there is no objective definition of what a terrorist is. And so sort of our understanding of what is a terrorist is only constructed through these debates that happen.
And why is it taboo to allege that a state can commit terrorism on a massive scale? I mean, we have night raids, drone bombings. I mean, do these actions not terrorize citizens?
Yeah, I mean, it's taboo because states don't want to be called terrorists, and states have a lot of symbolic authority. I mean, you have people out there, including some of the terrorism experts I study, who try to assert that states can in fact be terrorists, but it's very hard to make that assertion stick.
Thank you so much, Lisa Stampnitsky, author of Disciplining Terror, How Experts Invented Terrorism. Really appreciate your time. Extraordinary rendition. Those two words came to define the Bush administration's nefarious war on terror. Now the term is forever associated with the U.S. government's abduction and transfer of alleged terrorists to CIA black sites. There, prisoners could be indefinitely detained and tortured. Basically, it's exporting torture. But of course, all of that was supposed to change when a constitutional law professor took control of the executive branch. Obama initially promised us a new era of transparency and due process for all, no matter how grisly the alleged crime. Which brings us to last Saturday's joint raids by U.S. forces in Somalia and Libya. In Somalia, Navy SEAL Team 6, yes, that SEAL Team 6. I'm beginning to wonder if there's even a SEAL Team 1 through 5. Well, they unsuccessfully attempted to capture a high-value al-Shabaab target, presumably in retaliation for the group's deadly siege of a shopping mall in Nairobi last month. Then in Libya, U.S. Delta Force apprehended Abu Anas al-Libi, the alleged mastermind behind the 1998 bombings of U.S. embassies in Kenya and Tanzania, outside of his home in Tripoli. Of course, both of these raids were conducted without the Somali and Libyan government's knowledge and cooperation, which resulted in protests on behalf of Libyans who don't take too kindly to CIA blackbaggers in their country. But according to Secretary of State John Kerry, these actions were 100% legal and appropriate. Sorry, but I fail to see how it's appropriate to usurp the sovereignty of two nations, one over another country's mass shooting and another over a terrorist attack that happened 15 years ago. Now, according to military officials, al-Libi is being interrogated and held on a Navy warship somewhere in the Mediterranean Sea. Officials have acknowledged that al-Libi has not been read his Miranda rights and has no access to a lawyer, but will be arraigned in a U.S. courtroom at some point. Mind you, this could be a week, a month, a year, or however long it takes for interrogators to get the answers they want out of al-Libi. Shockingly, many are praising Obama for not employing drones to assassinate al-Libi from the sky. This sentiment alone reveals what an utter disgrace the discourse has become. Complimenting the president for illegally kidnapping alleged terrorists and potentially torturing them instead of murdering them only emboldens the false dichotomy of fighting the so-called war on terror. But the most stunning compliment of all came from former White House press secretary for W, Ari Fleischer, who tweeted earlier today, "Bush's fourth term continues. No lawyer interrogation, secret rendition, snatch and grab on sovereign soil, indefinite detention." No, that wasn't a criticism of the president. That was a glorification of Bush 2.0. Because apparently snatching sovereign citizens from sovereign lands for 15-year-old crimes is something to celebrate. Still ahead tonight, we'll speak to U.S. Customs whistleblower Kathy Harris. Many of you probably know about Miriam Carey, the woman who crashed into a gate near the White House and was subsequently executed by Capitol Police. And we all know this because the corporate media immediately zeroed in on the unfolding drama and turned it into a media circus, 24/7, frame by frame. But just one day after that tragedy, while pundits were busy psychoanalyzing Carey's mental condition, this happened. At 4:30 p.m. on October 4th, an unidentified African-American male doused himself in gasoline and lit himself on fire in the heart of Washington, D.C. He later died from his injuries after being airlifted to the hospital. This man chose to commit suicide in the middle of the National Mall, a historic site surrounded by museums and monuments. And before he erupted into flames, witnesses say he shouted something about voting rights and saluted to the Capitol building. Sadly, 3 days later, no one knows who this man was or what his motives for doing this were. But perhaps the most disturbing aspect of this unique incident is the utter lack of coverage from the corporate press. After only a blurb about this burning man, news anchors quickly switched back to talking about Carey's mental condition and the humdrum of political squabbling on the Hill. So why zero in on one tragic incident at the nation's capital but almost completely ignore the other? Yes, you can argue that the woman's act was more sensational, and that using a car as a deadly weapon is definitely easy fodder for disaster porn coverage. But knowing how much the corporate media loves to glom on to any disaster, big and small, its complete lack of analysis does seem like a glaring omission. Maybe it's because self-immolation usually signifies a powerful political statement, and it's confusing for people to rationalize someone behind being driven to such an act of desperation in America. You know, the land where dreams are made. I mean, they have to be completely mentally ill or insane, right? Perhaps. But was the Tunisian street vendor who self-immolated and sparked off the entire Arab Spring painted in the same way? No. In fact, he was hailed as a revolutionary, a martyr who was driven to such an act against all political odds. For centuries, self-immolation has long been seen as a form of radical protest against tyrannical regimes. As a child, I remember the media incessantly covering the Buddhist monks self-immolating during the Vietnam War. In fact, this form of protest is far from unique and is actually on the rise in industrialized countries in this era of global austerity and financial uncertainty. Dozens of people have set themselves on fire across Europe because of unemployment, Yet most of these tragic cases receive little to no media attention. In fact, just 1 week ago here in the U.S., a man in a business suit tried to light himself on fire in Houston after declaring that he couldn't find work. Before he was able to light the fire, he was arrested and is now being held for psychiatric evaluation. But are these people crazy? Or is the current environment of hopelessness a state that inevitably drives people to the edge? As Sarah Kendzior, writing for Al Jazeera, so eloquently states, quote, unemployment is not only the loss of a job, it's the loss of dignity. It's the loss of the present and, over time, the ability to imagine a future. It is hopelessness and shame, an open struggle everyone witnesses but pretends not to see. As a social and political crisis we tell a man to solve and blame him when he cannot. Sarah suggests that for the many who face these bleak conditions, self-immolation is a way to matter in the moment. Like the case of Malachi Richter, a Chicago man who self-immolated in 2006 to protest the Iraq War. He used his dying moment to send a powerful and eloquent message that made nothing more than a crazy man blip on the news. He wrote, quote, if I'm required to pay for your barbaric war, I choose not to live in your world. I refuse to finance the mass murder of innocent civilians who did nothing to threaten our country. I will not participate in your charade. My conscience will not allow me to be part of your crusade. Now, while this may be an uncomfortable topic for many, it's important that we pay attention and approach this ultimate self-sacrifice with empathy and compassion. Only then can we change the conditions that bring someone to such an act. Stop and frisk may have been ruled unconstitutional, but the man behind the idea, New York Police Commissioner Ray Kelly, insists that it's still the best policy. No surprise there, considering Kelly's history of implementing similar racially motivated policy prescriptions throughout his law enforcement tenure. In fact, as Customs Commissioner between 1998 and 2001, Kelly was subject to congressional scrutiny after an overwhelming amount of complaints about searches that disproportionately targeted African Americans. It was during this time that former U.S. Customs Inspector Kathy Harris blew the whistle on the agency for its blatant racial profiling. And later, a GAO report confirmed that black women were 9 times more likely to be frisked than white women. And now that Ray Kelly is being eyed as the top candidate for head of Homeland Security, Kathy Harris is speaking out again. She joins me now to discuss the real possibility and the implications Kelly's nomination could have for civil liberties. Thank you so much for coming on.
Thank you so much.
So your story is in this book, the Kathy Harris story, and let's go back to when you blew the whistle in 1998. You blew the whistle on abuse within the U.S. Customs Office. What did you see that was kind of like the straw that broke the camel's back?
Well, the fact that all the women, African-American women, were being taken to hospital and detained there for 4 days. They were being handcuffed to the bed for 4 days in order for my co-workers to make overtime money. And I just got sick of seeing it.
I'm sorry, they were detained for 4 days?
4 days
like,
at the hospital.
Wow. And way more, I mean, disproportionately to other races.
Right, right.
Talk about some other discriminatory practices that you saw during
Well,
this time.
in Miami, what they were doing down there, they were just handcuffing women to chairs to force them to have these strip searches. And the women that refused the strip searches, again, they would just handcuff them to the chairs outside the search room. So when all the travelers came in the country, they would ask us, well, why are all the women handcuffed to chairs? So it was a form of intimidation for these women to have these abusive pat-downs and illegal strip searches.
And you said that when people did speak out and filed complaints, they were actually blacklisted.
Yeah, they were blacklisted. Ray Kelly came in the agency and he told high-ranking managers to go after anyone who files an EEO complaint. Most whistleblowers are also EEO complainants. So Ray Kelly fired over 100 whistleblowers, and he created policies and procedures which made it harder, which made it easier for these employees to be fired.
What were some of those policies? Because 100 is an insane number.
Well, a bunch of them was out of Miami, because down there a reporter from Miami was also reporting on what was going on, some of the internal abuses. So again, it was just all kind of things that they were doing internally, mismanaging the agency. the agents, the inspectors, just a lot of things. And a lot of people came out and blew the whistles. Supervisor, high-ranking manager, GS-13, GS-14s. And Ray Kelly came in and he just fired all these people. That's how he was able to silence all of the travelers, because everybody who was speaking out against the travelers' abuse or against internal practices, he just fired them.
And I wanted to make this clear for the audience that Ray Kelly was actually hired to deal with the racial profiling, which is actually hilarious considering how he exacerbated the problem tenfold. I mean, would you say that considering how he actually came in here to rectify it but made it worse, does this problem go beyond just one bad apple? I mean, was this systematic?
It was always systematic. I mean, the racial profiling had took places for years before I came forward. I had seen it since the border, El Paso border, what they did to women down there. Then I went to Miami, I saw it there. Then I came to Atlanta, and I saw it there. So I had to eventually come forward and expose the abuses.
You know, and as we know, Ray Kelly is, of course, currently the head of the NYPD. He's the NYPD commissioner and the favorite pick for the DHS. If he is appointed, what sort of policies do you think that we can expect to see?
Well, I just think anything that he does, if he gets back in the agency, it's going to cause the employees to really have a, despair and hopelessness. People are on edge right now. They've lost a lot of hope. And to put a person like Ray Kelly back over Homeland Security, it's just going to be a bad thing to do right now for the employees.
Why do you think that even though judges ruled the stop and frisk unconstitutional, why is it still being used?
Well, I'm not sure about that, but the thing about it, if Ray Kelly gets back in the agency, he's very anti-whistleblower. He's anti-employee. Now, when the Whistleblower Protection Act passed in December of last year, NSA whistleblowers and intelligence whistleblowers wasn't covered. Also, TSA whistleblowers wasn't covered. So if Ray Kelly gets back in as Homeland Security Chief, of course he's going to go after the TSA whistleblowers. He's going to go after all these other whistleblowers. So, again, we do not want him. I think I speak for everybody. Even though I left there 8 years ago, I still know what's going on, and I speak for all the employees. They do not want Ray Kelly back in the agency.
Have you been following his record as the NYPD commissioner? I mean, what has he been doing there that kind of proves your point? Well,
he's been making statements saying that African Americans deserve to be stopped and frisked more than any other race simply because they commit more crimes. That is what he's been telling people in the news. I mean, he not only promotes racial profiling, but he allows it to take place.
I guess the biggest question of all is, why is this administration even thinking about appointing someone who is just openly racist and implementing such a ridiculous unconstitutional program in New York?
I have no idea why they're thinking about electing him. I mean, I'm sure there are some other candidates which would do a better job. It's just that I'm just hoping that they don't put this guy back in his position.
Do you think it's strange at all that this administration is almost rewarding someone for just having complete disregard for civil liberties?
But that's how the federal government works. I mean, I was a federal government employee for 27 years, and they reward the bad and punish the good. They've always done that.
Why? That's horrible.
But that's the federal government. That's just how they operate. They go after people who file EEO complaints, even though it's their right to file these complaints. That is just how the system is set up. We've tried to fix the system. There are all kind of organizations out there that have tried to fix the system, and they can't. The whole EEOC system needs to be abolished and redone again. And they've tried to do this, and at this point, it's no hope.
Well, I guess, yeah, I mean, you have your book out. You're trying to lobby to prevent his appointment from going through, of course. What can people do to help prevent this? But really, as you just said, the system's broken. I mean, aren't you worried that someone kind of like Ray Kelly will just get in that role anyway?
Well, if he do, what we need to do is form an oversight committee to monitor whoever they put in this position, to monitor everything that they do. But right now, everybody needs to go to all their legislators and tell their legislators to block this nomination.
And what can people do to help sign that petition?
Well, there's tons of petitions on the internet. So just Google the petitions on the internet, block Ray Kelly. There's a ton of petitions. So we want everybody to sign the petitions and to go to your legislators and tell them to block the election of Ray Kelly.
All right, well, I'm with you there. Thank you so much for coming on and sharing your story. Kathy Harris, former Customs and Border Patrol Senior Officer and Whistleblower. Appreciate it.
Okay.
See you tomorrow. Have a great night. Be right here to Brock the Set.